politics is not one of them. That said, I believe more strongly than ever that America's global leadership is essential to preserving the shining city on a hill that Ronald Reagan discussed. As long as I'm drawing breath on this earth, I will defend American exceptionalism. So as I've been thinking about when I would deliver some news to the Senate, I always imagined a moment when I had total clarity and peace about the sunset of my work. A moment when I'm certain I have helped preserve the ideals I so strongly believed. That day arrived today. My goals when I was narrowly elected to the Senate back in 1984 were fairly modest. Do a good job for the people of Kentucky and convince them that by doing so they might rehire me for a second term. That was it. That was the plan. If you would have told me 40 years later that I would stand before you as the longest-serving Senate leader in American history, frankly, I would have thought you'd lost your mind. I have the honor of representing Kentucky in the Senate longer than anyone else in our state's history. I just never could have imagined that happening when I arrived here in 1984 at 42. I'm filled with heartfelt gratitude and humility for the opportunity. But now it's 2024. I'm now 82. As Ecclesiastes tells us, to everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under heaven. To serve Kentucky in the Senate has been the honor of my life. To lead my Republican colleagues has been the highest privilege. But one of life's most underappreciated talents is to know when it's time to move on to life's next chapter. So I stand before you today, Mr. President, and my colleagues, to say this will be my last term as Republican leader of the Senate. I'm not going anywhere anytime soon. However, I'll complete my job my colleagues have given me until we select a new leader in November and they take the helm next January. I'll finish the job the people of Kentucky hired me to do as well, albeit from a different seat, and I'm actually looking forward to that. So it's time for me to think about another season. I love the Senate. It's been my life. There may be more distinguished members of this body throughout our history, but I doubt there were any with any more admiration for the Senate. After all this time, I still get a thrill walking into the Capitol, and especially on this venerable floor, knowing that we, each of us, have the honor to represent our states and do the important work of our country. But Father Time remains undefeated. I'm no longer the young man sitting in the back, hoping colleagues would remember my name. It's time for the next generation of leadership. As Henry Clay said in this very body in 1850, the Constitution of the United States was not made merely for the generation that then existed, but for posterity. Unlimited, undefined, endless, perpetual posterity. So time rolls on. There'll be a new custodian of this great institution next year. Won't surprise you to know I intend to turn this job over to a Republican majority leader. I have full confidence in my conference to choose my replacement and lead our country forward. There'll be other times to reminisce. I'm immensely proud of the accomplishments I've played some role in obtaining for the American people. Today is not the day to discuss all of that, because as I said earlier, I'm not going anywhere anytime soon. There are many challenges we must meet to deliver for the American people, and each will have my full effort and attention. I still have enough gas in my tank to thoroughly disappoint my critics, and I intend to do so with all the enthusiasm with which they become accustomed. So to my colleagues, thank you for entrusting me with our success. It's been an honor to work with each of you. There'll be plenty of time to express my gratitude in greater detail as I sprint towards the finish line, which is now in sight. I yield the floor.
That was Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell speaking on the Senate floor, announcing that he'll be stepping down as Republican leader in November. McConnell is the longest-serving Senate leader in American history. He says it's been the honor of his life and the highest privilege, but that it's time to move on to life's next chapter. Despite stepping down from his leadership role, he says he'll continue in the Senate and finish the job the people of Kentucky elected him to do. Let's bring in ABC's Jay O'Brien on Capitol Hill for more. Jay, given the back and forth and the recent shift in the Republican Party, how significant is this?
It's incredibly significant, Diane. I mean, if you think of the stamp that Mitch McConnell has left, not just on the history of the United States Congress, not just on the history of the Senate, but on American history in and of itself, losing his voice in the Republican Party is extremely significant. So think about what Mitch McConnell has done here. Firstly, his legacy is defined by his reshaping alongside former President Trump, then President Trump, of the federal judiciary, confirming conservative justices and stacking the federal judiciary with conservative justices. The Supreme Court, he holds open the nomination for Justice Scalia's replacement, remember, during President Obama's last few months. And that's how you end up getting not Justice Merrick Garland, who's now the Attorney General, but instead Justice Gorsuch. And the list goes on. He also was a vocal member here on Capitol Hill of continued support for Ukraine. He referenced that in his remarks just moments ago, in which he said, he talked about America's role in the free world. And he said, quote, "I know the politics in my party," referring to the fact that some Republicans are in opposition to funding Ukraine in its defense against Russia. But McConnell underscoring there how vital he believes Ukraine's struggle is for the future of the free world. And so losing his voice on those issues in Republican leadership will be very significant for Senate Republicans. He's not leaving the Senate, as he indicated in those remarks, but he has been leading Senate Republicans for quite some time. Again, he is the longest serving leader in the United States, in the history of the United States Senate. So his voice not in the room, as it has been for decades on those issues, is going to have a very significant impact on Republicans' trajectory in the Senate and, frankly, in the United States Congress going forward.
Jay, what's next from here? What are you hearing about his plans after stepping down, and who could possibly replace him?
So again, it indicates from his remarks that he won't leave office, meaning he'll continue to serve the remainder of his term as the senior senator from Kentucky. He just won't be in Senate leadership anymore. That transition is going to be very interesting to watch, because McConnell has had an iron grip on Republicans in the Senate for really his entire tenure. He has been known for years as a keen tactician, someone who knows how to use his power as a leader of Republicans in that chamber chamber to exert his will and how to get things done. We know that there are already some Republicans who have lined up to replace McConnell because the question has been out for quite some time as how long he would serve in his role as leader. John Thune, the number 2 Republican in the Senate, is a name that's getting thrown around a lot. John Barrasso, the number 3 Republican in the Senate as well. John Cornyn is another name to keep in mind. By the by, those individuals, at least 2 of them, perhaps all 3, I noticed there on the Senate floor shaking Mitch McConnell's hand as he ended those remarks. John Thune was the very tall gentleman. You saw John Cornyn's white hair there on the Senate floor as well. So there will be a race amongst Senate Republicans as to who will be Mitch McConnell's successor. And it will likely expose some divisions amongst Senate Republicans that we've frankly already seen, Diane. Some more hardline Senate Republicans have made a show in recent years of showing that they do not believe McConnell shares their point of view. They do not believe he is as conservative as they are. And there was even an attempt when Republicans took control of the House and there was a reshaping in the Senate of ousting McConnell from his leadership role. That was unsuccessful. It was not expected to succeed when it happened. But you can expect those hardline conservatives like Rick Scott also to play a role in who McConnell's successor will be and be very vocal as that process plays out.
Jay, what sort of legacy is Mitch McConnell leaving behind as Republican leader?
I think there's 3 elements to his legacy that come to mind right now. The first is what you and I discussed, which is the reshaping of the federal judiciary, the confirming of conservative justices, the reshaping of the United States Supreme Court that has led to those tectonic shifts in American politics, like the overturning of Roe and things of that nature. That court was fashioned by Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump. And Mitch McConnell will tell you that is a central piece of his legacy, the judiciary. Another that has only come up in recent years is funding for Ukraine in its defense against Russia. I had one lawmaker describe to me that they believe Mitch McConnell views that as a central pillar of his legacy to try to arm Ukraine, again, in its defense against Russia and in the broader question of Ukraine's role in the free world. And then the third is something that is not of McConnell's making, which is how Mitch McConnell has stayed in his current role given the shifts in the Republican Party in the age of Donald Trump. In the early tenure of the Trump administration, or in Donald Trump's early tenure as president, Mitch McConnell worked with him on tax cuts and things of that nature. He was an ally of Donald Trump's in the Senate. And then, of course, as the Trump administration continued, it ended in January 6th, and that attack on the Capitol, there was that very public break between Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump, where Mitch McConnell was sharply critical of the president's actions that day, saying that the former president bared responsibility for that mob attack on the Capitol. Mitch McConnell, in sense, has not gone as far as some Republicans and certainly Democrats wanted to see from him in his rebukes of Trump. He did not vote to convict Donald Trump, for instance, in his second impeachment on the Senate floor. He said it was an issue of precedent. But certainly Mitch McConnell, you heard him talk about in his statement or in his remarks on the Senate floor that he was a Reagan Republican. And think of how much the Republican Party has shifted and changed while Mitch McConnell has worked his way up to the leadership in the Senate and then stayed in that role as the leader of Senate Republicans.
Now, Jay, this comes amid some growing concern over McConnell's health. He appeared to freeze while talking with reporters a few months ago. That happened on 2 separate occasions. So what do we know about his health right now?
So we know, I'll take you back to the summer. Those 2 instances of him freezing during press conferences occurred, one in July and one in August. The first was at a press conference here at the Capitol where he froze. He appeared to not hear a reporter's question, and he appeared to not remember where he was in his remarks, and he just stepped to the side and was then ushered back into his office. He did emerge later and say that he was fine. Then he had another incident freezing at a press conference and a media availability in Kentucky when the Senate was on recess. And that sparked, as you noted, Diane, a lot of questions about what Mitch McConnell's health picture was. Mitch McConnell's office gave a number of different reasonings for freezing, but one of them was that they said he was dehydrated and exhausted and things of that nature. He had just recovered from an illness at that point as well. His office said he had a public fall, remember, at an event here in Washington, D.C., too. So there was this specter of questions around his health. Now, Mitch McConnell in recent months has given interviews in which he said from those instances of freezing. He's fully recovered. He said he was fine. He said he's certainly willing and able to continue with the job. But in stepping down from leadership today, firstly, it takes a lot off his plate. Being the leader of Republicans in the Senate is not an easy job. And secondly, he did acknowledge that in his remarks, if I'm paraphrasing him correctly, Father Time always wins in the end. And he was essentially saying it's time for a new era of Republican leadership in the Senate.
Now, McConnell says he still has gas in the tank to surprise his critics. What do you think that means? What are you watching for in these last few months of his leadership?
Well, it's definitely a recognition of the fact that, A, he is going to serve out the remaining months until November as the Senate leader. You can expect him in those months to, A, reflect on his legacy, as he noted in those remarks, but B, continue pressure on his policy goals, one of which, as we have repeatedly discussed, is continued aid for Ukraine, which is still stalled right now in the Congress. Remember, the Senate passed a $95 billion foreign aid package that includes aid for Ukraine and for Israel. It was passed after a lot of work, frankly, on Mitch McConnell's behalf in the Senate. And then, of course, it gets sent over to the House, where it's still currently stalled. Speaker Mike Johnson has indicated he's not going to put it on the House floor without some kind of border security provisions in it. If that sounds familiar, as you and I have discussed before, it is, because Mike Johnson has said that before. That's what kicked off bipartisan negotiations on the border in the Senate, the product of which Mitch McConnell championed and Mike Johnson ultimately rejected because he said it wasn't hardline conservative enough. So you can expect Mitch McConnell to continue to bring up this issue of Ukraine. Look no further, frankly, than that meeting that occurred in the White House yesterday between President Biden and the big four congressional leaders. We know from sources that Mitch McConnell was the lawmaker in that room amongst Democrats and the president who was making the hardest case to Speaker Johnson of the need to pass aid for Ukraine right now, of the urgency of the need for that aid, of the fact that Ukrainians are running out of armaments, running out of munitions, and losing in some instances to Russia on the battlefield. So expect Mitch McConnell to continue to bring that up.
And now, McConnell met with President Biden and the other congressional leaders at the White House yesterday. They discussed a bill to send aid to Ukraine and plans to avert a government shutdown. They also talked about the situation at the border. What role is McConnell playing in these negotiations, and does any of that change with this announcement?
It's not certain it will change with this announcement, but as you and I were just discussing, he is very vocal on continued aid for Ukraine, and he made the case the strongest, our sources say, amongst the lawmakers in that meeting with the president, as we were just discussing. I think there's another element of this, though, which is how does Mitch McConnell exert influence in the next few months, in the remaining months of his tenure as Speaker, on that part of his party that doesn't agree with him on certain key policy issues, Ukraine being chief among them. I'll take you back, as we discussed a few moments ago, to a comment that Mitch McConnell made on the Senate floor just moments ago when he was announcing. He said, quote, "I am aware of the politics in my party." So you can expect him to have to navigate that for his last remaining months as Senate Republican leader.
Capitol Hill. Jay, thank you. We'll be right back.